I want to celebrate your excellent work here in doing your detective work together about the hand of Leonardo. It's a pleasure to read what you've all come up with, and I hope you enjoyed doing it. It's supposed to be a fun exercise in that you actually are really doing the kind of detective work that actually happens in attributing artworks. So, for instance, the very famous Dutch painter Rembrandt, who you would learn about if you take Art History 197, Baroque to Modern, for the last, oh gosh, almost 50 years, since 1968, there have been a team of scholars working to determine which are authentic Rembrandts and which are not. The work is unfinished to this day. It still needs to be going on, and they have added some Rembrandts, but they've actually removed a lot. So the interesting question is, how do you go about doing that, right? That's a team of scholars, art historian experts working collaboratively. Well, you did that, and your reasoning was very sound. I think this exercise is important because it actually makes you very aware of the process of reasoning, which is basically what critical thinking is. Being able to think about your own thinking, being aware of what evidence am I using to come to my conclusions. And so that's very interesting in terms of organizing your thoughts. All of you have done a great job of organizing how you've gone about this and what kinds of evidence you've looked at, which is essential to doing good analytic work. But you've all had different principles of organization, so you can learn from each other's. I hope you will go and read carefully what your other groups have done. So for instance, group one, Christine's group, they were thinking primarily in terms of techniques and kind of laying out what are the different techniques that would be associated with Leonardo. The contrast of dark and light colors and the gentle transitions between them. That's a big one. Also, the depth of the backgrounds. This is an important idea that others were thinking about too. That deep space of nature that goes back, as well as the chiaroscuro technique. Their other focal point was anatomy and proportion. And one of the things that they did very well is they mobilized a quote. That's a word that people in academia love to use. You mobilize your evidence. You bring it to bear on your thinking. So they mobilized a quote that explains not only is the anatomy about precise details, but about the geometry of perfect proportions. And then they did that again with their consideration of the pyramidal structure, the pyramidal composition. And again, they used a quote to kind of connect what they're seeing in this one painting by Verrocchio to what we've seen in other Leonardo paintings. Certainly you can see the pyramidal structure here. You can see that deep space. You can see the anatomy, the chiaroscuro. And so group two had a different organizing structure, but you'll see there's a lot of overlap in their interests. Their first focal point is how nature and geology are working. And that does certainly echo with what group one did. So they're talking about aerial perspective. They're talking about the backgrounds that are used in Renaissance paintings. They're also integrating an examination of technique with this concern for the themes of nature and geography. The utilization of sfumato, a technique of gradually shading colors into each other, resulting in soft edges and a misty-looking blending of the paint. That's a nice detail, a nice definition. And then they do a wonderful thing in terms of mobilizing evidence, is they go to one of the links that was provided in the module page, and they cite the British Library collection, talking about how many of his exploratory drawings were really studying the flow of rivers and water, astronomy, flight of birds, and optics. All of these ways in which he's not just portraying nature, he's actually trying to unlock its secrets, to understand it. So in terms of thinking creatively about evidence to empower your reasoning, this was mobilizing a related body of evidence, moving from the painting itself as a place to examine to drawings that can tell us something about what Leonardo might have brought to that painting. And certainly these studies of water, which are so exquisitely beautiful, are absolutely relevant. And they do an excellent thing here when they move on to human anatomy, is they actually specify places where you can see, specific places where you can see a level of anatomic detail that is associated with Da Vinci. And they say the face of Jesus, portions of Jesus's chest, the feet of Jesus and John in the water, and the second cherub boy angel closest to Jesus. Okay, face, chest, feet in the water. Yeah, being able to show the feet through the water, that translucency where you get the sense of the surface as a surface. That's pretty amazing. And then our angels here. Again, what's very strong here is not just that they are aware of human anatomy as a focal point, but they are mobilizing so much relevant evidence, but also different kinds of evidence. The historical fact of dissecting human bodies, but also the evidence of Vitruvian man as how he's going beyond just naming the parts of the body to integrating geometry and mechanics. So this is, again, exemplary work. They even talk about the technical manipulation of oils and tempera paints to present the illusion and sensuality of the physical body's touch, texture, emotion. And when they move on to miscellaneous observations, they kind of dig even deeper to talk about the draping of the cloth. Notice how narrowing in to get more specific is one of the best things you can do in critical analysis. Students often think that they should come up with the biggest, broadest statement, and in reality, it's the opposite. If you go down to the form of the draping of the cloth, you're getting very specific and very strong. And they link that to his amazing proto-science with studying traveling light waves and refraction. And that actually relates somewhat to what Group 3 did. And so one of their masterful moves that I love so much was to actually give us these marvelous close-up juxtapositions. And this one relates to what Group 2 was talking about, lighting and its interaction between the fabric in both the baptism of Christ and the Virgin of the Rocks. What a brilliant thing to do, to give us these fragments that are a focal point, like a scientist, taking a tissue sample. This is kind of amazing because it's actually it's a very revered method in art history when you're looking to make attributions. So a very famous 19th century art historian named Giovanni Morelli, he's looking at you here from out of his portrait and you're looking at him. He had a brilliant insight that continues to be essential in the work of the detective work of attributing artworks. His insight was that you often have to look, if you're going to be diagnostic, meaning you're going to actually decide what artist made this, you often have to look at a kind of tiny, seemingly trivial detail. The example he used was ears. How does this artist make their ears? The place where the artist was just doing their thing and wouldn't have been thinking too much about whether they're presenting this artwork in the way they want. They're kind of going, and you could almost say unconsciously. So Claire's group is absolutely channeling Morelli when they give us this marvelous juxtaposition of little baby Jesus's head from the Virgin of the Rocks with the angel. Look at the cheeks, look at the noses, look at the hair. Yes, indeed. So in terms of the baptism of Christ, there is 100% scholarly consensus that Leonardo da Vinci did the two angels. There's some debate about whether he did one and then Verrocchio got in there and copied, but this is the one that we know most strongly for exactly the reasons that you've just laid out. It's interesting because there's every reason to believe that Leonardo must have done the background, that deep background, and certainly things like the water. It gets sketchier with the question of Jesus and John the Baptist, because the contracts at the time generally said that the master of the workshop must do the main figures. So it's possible, there's a couple of possibilities, that Verrocchio learned a thing or two from Leonardo, because he was a smart guy. He's a good artist. He's a sculptor who can also paint. He's very talented, but he clearly knows that this person painting those angels and that deep landscape is something out of this world. So it's very possible that he adopted things, and it's also possible that they worked on it together, and that would have passed muster. It's interesting though to see the things that clearly Leonardo didn't do, like this palm tree, which has no soft edges, right? It's like a plastic poolside palm tree at a cheap motel because it's so hard and rigid looking. The hands of God. Really, don't you wish that Leonardo had been able to give the hands of God, because they would have been, I think, less schematic and stylized and just kind of fake looking, because Leonardo could make nature seem so alive.